No fridge, no freezer, no plastic wrap, no expiration dates. Medieval people had to preserve meat with nothing but salt, smoke, fat, and sheer bloody-minded determination. I tried 10 of their methods over 30 days. Some were delicious. Some looked like they belonged in a horror movie. All of them worked. And yes, I ate every single one. Method 7 looked like a mad scientist's failed experiment. Until day 30, when it transformed into something that would make Italian butchers weep with envy. This is what survival tasted like when refrigeration meant praying for winter. Before we dive in, let's set the scene. It's 1347. The Black Death is sweeping Europe. Your local supermarket is a muddy field and some very nervous pigs. Winter is coming, and I don't mean that metaphorically. Food preservation wasn't just convenience. It was the thin line between hearty peasant meal and skeleton in a ditch. These techniques fed armies, powered exploration, and kept entire civilizations alive through famines that could last years. Here's what I tested. Salt barrels that could mummify a horse. Brine tubs that could pickle your enemies. Smokehouses that turned meat into leather candy. Loft drying that required reading the weather like a medieval meteorologist. Confit that turned fat into liquid gold. Vinegar pickling that could strip paint. Fermented sausages that looked cursed but tasted divine. Aspic jellies fit for kings. Alcoholic marinades that got your dinner drunk. And honey sealing that cost more than most people's houses. Let's start where every medieval kitchen did, with salt, humanity's first chemical weapon against time. Behold the salt box, medieval food preservation's nuclear option. Simple, merciless, and effective enough to power empires. The concept? Bury meat in salt until it looks like it died in a blizzard. Then wait for chemistry to work its magic. Medieval cooks didn't know about osmotic pressure or water activity levels. They just knew that salt was basically kryptonite for bacteria. The salt pulls water out of the meat through osmosis, creating an environment so hostile that even the toughest microbes throw up their tiny hands and surrender. Salt was so valuable that Roman soldiers were literally paid in it. That's where we get salary. A pound of salt in medieval Britain could cost a day's wages. But that same pound could preserve 20 pounds of meat for months. Talk about return on investment. The process was an art form. Too little salt? Hello, food poisoning. Too much? You've made meat-flavored rocks. Medieval salters developed a sixth sense. They could tell by touch when the salt had penetrated deep enough, when the meat had reached that magical point where bacteria couldn't survive. Different cuts required different approaches. Thin pieces needed a light salting for a few days. Whole hams, buried in salt for weeks, rotated regularly, resalted when necessary. Some European families had salt cellars older than cathedrals, with salt that had been used for generations. When Vikings crossed the Atlantic, yes, 500 years before Columbus got lost, their ships were loaded with salt-cured meat. When armies marched across continents, salt pork was their fuel. This wasn't just food preservation, this was civilization in a crock. Of course, eating it was another story. After weeks in salt, this meat had the texture of leather and the sodium content of seawater. Hours of soaking, hours of boiling, prayers to whatever gods watched over medieval kitchens. Effective? Absolutely. Delicious? Well, let's just say medieval people had different priorities than we do. From salt mountains to salt seas, enter brining, the gentler cousin of dry salting. Instead of turning your meat into a geological specimen, Medieval kitchens submerged it in brine, so concentrated it could float an egg. Literally, that was their quality control test. The science is beautiful. Salt water penetrates meat more evenly than dry salt, creating uniform preservation throughout. Plus, you could add spices to the brine: bay leaves, juniper berries, whatever grew nearby. Suddenly, your preserved meat had actual flavor instead of just salt. But here's where medieval food preservation got tricky. Brine was a living system. Done right, it stayed clear and sweet-smelling for weeks. Done wrong, it turned into what I can only describe as Satan's soup. Cloudy, foul-smelling, and capable of killing everyone who came near it. Medieval cooks became brine whisperers. They'd smell it every day, checking for that telltale sour smell that meant bad bacteria had moved in. They'd taste it. Yes, taste the brine that raw meat had been sitting in, to detect off flavors. When brine started to turn, they had hours to either reboil it to kill the nasties or dump the whole batch. The smart ones kept mother brine, a perpetual brine that could be refreshed with new salt and herbs. Some English manor houses maintained the same brine for decades, passing it down like a sourdough starter. Imagine the stories that brine could tell. Different regions developed signature brines. Germans added caraway and mustard seeds. French cooks preferred thyme and bay leaves. English brines were heavy on ale and sage. Each family guarded their brine recipe like a state secret, because in many ways, it was. Smoke, nature's most seductive preservative. For thousands of years, humans have been hanging meat in smoke and somehow making it better. Medieval Northern Europeans turned this into high art. Meat would hang in rafters above the hearth, bathed in aromatic smoke for days or even weeks. But not just any smoke would do. Medieval smokers were basically sommelier. They understood that oak gave strength and depth. Apple added sweetness. Hickory brought that bacon-like intensity. Cherry wood turned meat beautiful shades of mahogany. Beech was the workmanlike choice for everyday smoking. Here's the science. Smoke contains over 100 compounds, including phenols and aldehydes that are basically nature's antiseptics. These chemicals penetrate the meat and create a hostile environment for bacteria. But, and this is crucial, smoke alone doesn't preserve. It needs salt first to draw out moisture. Medieval smokers became masters at reading smoke like medieval weathermen read clouds. Thick white smoke? You're making bitter charcoal. Thin blue smoke? That's the golden ticket. Clean burning, flavor-packed, bacteria-killing perfection. Temperature control was everything. Too hot, above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're cooking the meat, not preserving it. Too cool, and bacteria win the race against preservation. The best smokehouses had ingenious systems: fire pits separated from smoking chambers, adjustable vents, even water pans to control humidity. The process took patience that would make a Zen monk jealous. 3 days minimum for small cuts. 2 weeks for whole hams. Some German Black Forest hams were smoked for months, developing flavors so complex they were basically meat wine. Done right. Smoked meat lasted months and tasted like concentrated awesomeness. Done wrong? You got bitter, inedible chunks that could be used as projectiles. Medieval armies literally used poorly smoked meat as ammunition during sieges. So far, we've covered the Holy Trinity: salt, brine, and smoke. But medieval cooks weren't content to stop there. What happened when salt was scarce? When winter was too mild for proper smoking? When you needed to preserve meat without any fire at all? That's when medieval ingenuity kicked into overdrive. They turned to techniques that seem almost magical, harnessing air, fat, acid, alcohol, even beneficial bacteria they didn't know existed. Let's dive into the really weird stuff. Sometimes the most powerful preservative was absolutely nothing at all. Just meat, hanging in moving air, slowly transforming from fresh protein into leathery survival candy. Medieval jerky, if you will, but elevated to an art form. This wasn't just hang it and hope. Medieval air drying was meteorological engineering. Successful preservers understood wind patterns like sailors understood tides. They knew which direction to face their drying chambers, how altitude affected the process, even which months provided the perfect combination of cool temperatures and low humidity. In the Alps, they built specialized spec chambers, stone rooms with carefully positioned windows that caught crosswinds. The air would flow in one side, pick up moisture from the drying meat, and flow out the other side. Natural air conditioning, medieval style. The science is actually brilliant. As water evaporates from the meat, it concentrates proteins and salts, creating an environment where bacteria can't survive. Properly dried meat loses 60 to 70% of its water weight, but gains months of shelf life. But timing was everything. Too humid, and you're not making preserved meat. You're cultivating a science experiment that could kill half the village. Medieval preservers could read humidity in the air like we read thermometers. They knew when fog was coming, when rain was 2 days away, when conditions were perfect for starting a new batch. Different regions developed signature styles: Italian Bresaola, Swiss Bündnerfleisch, Turkish Pastırma, all variations on this ancient theme. Some families have recipes dating back 600 years, still using techniques passed down through generations of mountain dwellers who understood that patience and perfect conditions could turn ordinary meat into something extraordinary. When everything aligned, cool temperatures, low humidity, steady airflow. This method produced some of the longest-lasting preserved meat of all. Properly air-dried meat could last years. Years. Some medieval explorers carried air-dried meat that was older than their children. Now we enter the realm of medieval luxury preservation. Confit. Salt the meat. Cook it gently in its own fat. Then seal it under a thick cap of lard. This was survival food disguised as aristocracy. Preservation masquerading as indulgence. The technique came from pure practicality. When you slaughtered an animal, you used everything or starved. The fat wasn't waste. It was liquid preservation, edible packaging, and flavor enhancer all rolled into one. Here's the science. Fat creates an anaerobic environment. No oxygen means no aerobic bacteria can survive. Cook the meat slowly enough, and you denature proteins and kill any nasties hiding inside. Seal it properly under fat, and you've created a medieval vacuum seal. But this wasn't just dumping meat in grease. Medieval confit was a precise art. The cooking temperature had to be perfect, around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Too hot, and the meat would dry out. Too cool, and you wouldn't kill the bacteria. The fat had to be rendered slowly, filtered carefully, kept at exactly the right consistency. French peasants perfected this with duck and goose. Those birds are basically swimming in their own preservation medium. But pork, beef, lamb, even rabbit worked beautifully. The key was cooking until the meat fell apart at a touch, then complete submersion in rendered fat. Different fats produced different results. Duck fat was the Rolls-Royce, rich, flavorful, and perfect for long-term storage. Pork lard was the workhorse, cheap, effective, and neutral tasting. Beef tallow worked but could get grainy. Goose fat was legendary. Some medieval recipes claimed goose confit could last 2 years. The storage was as important as the cooking. Clay crocks sealed with more fat, stored in cool cellars, turned regularly to prevent settling. Some French farmhouses had confit cellars with hundreds of sealed crocks, each labeled with contents and date. Medieval meal prep taken to absurd levels. Opening a perfectly aged confit was a religious experience. The fat would crack like breaking a seal, revealing meat so tender it could be spread like butter. So flavorful it made fresh meat seem bland in comparison. This was preservation as indulgence. And unlike every other method so far, this one actually improved the meat. Enter the sour sciences. Vinegar preservation. While other methods relied on removing water or excluding air, vinegar took a different approach. Make the environment so acidic that bacteria would rather find somewhere else to live. Medieval vinegar wasn't the mild stuff you drizzle on salads. This was industrial-strength acid, made from wine that had gone aggressively wrong. The acetic acid dropped pH levels so low that most harmful bacteria simply couldn't survive. We're talking pH levels around 2.5, basically liquid hostility toward microbes. But medieval cooks weren't content to just dump meat in acid and call it a day. They turned vinegar preservation into culinary alchemy. Honey for sweetness to balance the pucker, herbs like rosemary, and thyme for complexity. Spices, black pepper, coriander, sometimes precious cinnamon, that cost more than most people made in a month. The process required timing that would make a Swiss clockmaker jealous. First, the meat was cooked. Never raw, because raw meat in vinegar is basically salmonella soup. Then, while still warm, it was packed into crocks with the spice mixture. Finally, boiling vinegar was poured over everything, creating a hissing, steaming cauldron of preservation. Different vinegars produced wildly different results. Wine vinegar was the premium choice. Complex, fruity, expensive. Ale vinegar was the working-class option. Sharp, effective, cheap. Apple vinegar, when available, added sweetness. Some regions made vinegar from whatever fermented locally. Pear vinegar, honey vinegar, even vinegar made from fermented fish sauce. For medieval Christians, vinegar preservation was basically a theological loophole. During Lent, when eating meat was forbidden, preserved meat was often allowed, especially if it had been preserved long enough to be considered transformed. Pickled beef during Lent wasn't breaking religious law, it was following it creatively. Long sea voyages relied heavily on pickled meat. It provided stable, long-lasting protein that could survive months in a ship's hold without spoiling, unlike fresh meat that would rot within days at sea. Some naval records show ships carrying pickled beef that was over a year old and still perfectly edible. The result? Imagine if beef jerky married a pickle and had children. Intensely sour, deeply flavorful, and with a texture that ranged from pleasantly chewy to requires industrial-strength jaw muscles. Medieval people loved it. Modern palates. Well, it's an acquired taste. Now we venture into the realm of medieval biotechnology. Fermented sausage. This was preservation by controlled bacterial warfare, turning harmful microbes against each other in a biological battle royale inside a pig intestine. Medieval butchers didn't know about lactobacillus or pH gradients or any of the science behind fermentation. They just knew that if you mixed ground meat with salt, stuffed it into casings, and hung it in the right conditions, something magical happened. Raw meat transformed into something safe, delicious, and long-lasting. Day 1 looks like regular sausage. Day 3 covered in what appears to be fungal death. Day 7 still looks like something from a witch's laboratory. But inside, an invisible war was raging between good bacteria and bad bacteria. The bacteria and the good guys were winning. The process relied on beneficial bacteria naturally present in the meat and environment. These good bacteria, primarily lactobacillus, consume sugars and produce lactic acid, dropping the pH from a bacteria-friendly 6.5 to a bacteria-hostile 5.2 or lower. At that point, harmful bacteria like Salmonella and E. coli simply can't survive. Medieval butchers developed techniques that would impress modern food scientists. They'd save starter from successful batches, basically live bacterial cultures passed down through generations. They understood that certain weather conditions worked better. They knew which animals produced the best sausage meat. Different regions developed wildly different styles. Italian salami with wine and garlic, German wursts with caraway and smoke, Spanish chorizo with paprika that turned everything bright red, French saucissons with herbs that grew in local hills. Each style reflected local ingredients, climate, and centuries of trial and error. The hanging environment was crucial. Too warm, and bad bacteria multiplied faster than good bacteria. Too cold, and fermentation never started. Too humid, and mold took over completely. Too dry, and the casings cracked, exposing the interior to contamination. Master sausage makers could read their hanging rooms like fortune tellers. They knew when humidity was perfect, when air circulation was right, when the season was ideal for starting new batches. Some European sausage caves are still operating after centuries, using the same techniques passed down through generations. This was the riskiest preservation method I attempted. Get it wrong, and you're not making food. You're making biological weapons. Get it right, and you're producing something that puts modern supermarket salami to shame. Medieval sausage makers were basically gambling with their families' lives every time they started a new batch. After 30 days of looking like something cursed, the results were extraordinary. Tangy, complex, with flavors that developed over weeks of careful fermentation. This wasn't just preserved meat. This was transformed meat, elevated through the ancient alchemy of beneficial bacteria. Enter the most elegant preservation method of all. Aspic. Picture meat suspended in crystal clear gelatin like flies in amber. Preserved not just for survival, but for spectacle. This was medieval Instagram food, centuries before anyone knew what Instagram was. The process started with bones. Lots of bones. Beef bones, veal bones, sometimes pig's feet for extra gelatin. These were boiled for hours until they released their collagen, creating a stock so rich it would set into firm jelly when cooled. No artificial gelatin, no chemical additives, just patient extraction of natural binding agents. But aspic wasn't just practical preservation. It was culinary architecture. Medieval cooks layered different meats, suspended vegetables like jewels, even created patterns with herbs and spices. When sliced, a good aspic revealed intricate designs that looked like edible stained glass windows. The gelatin created an airtight seal around the meat, keeping oxygen out and flavor in. Properly made aspic could preserve meat for weeks without any other preservation method. Plus, the gelatin itself was nutritious. Medieval cooks understood nose-to-tail eating centuries before it became trendy. Different types of stock produced different results. Clear beef stock created transparent aspic that showed off the contents. Cloudy chicken stock was more forgiving but less spectacular. Fish stock, made from bones and heads, created light, delicate aspics, perfect for Lent. Aspic was seasonal preservation, tied to feast days and special occasions. Christmas aspics featured spiced meats and golden saffron. Easter versions incorporated spring herbs and young vegetables. Wedding feasts showcased aspics so elaborate they were basically edible sculptures. The technique required perfect timing. Too warm, and the aspic wouldn't set. Too cold too quickly, and the gelatin would separate. Medieval cooks had to judge temperature by feel, knowing exactly when stock was ready to pour, when it would set properly, when it was safe to unmold. This wasn't long-term storage like salt or smoke. Aspic was short-term but spectacular preservation. It kept meat fresh for days or weeks, perfect for special occasions when you needed food that was both safe and impressive. Medieval banquet aspics were conversation pieces that happened to be edible. When vinegar was scarce and salt was expensive, medieval cooks turned to the pub for preservation help: alcoholic marinades. Ale, wine, mead, whatever was fermenting locally became a preservation medium that actually improved flavor while keeping meat safe. The science is elegant. Alcohol kills surface bacteria while acids from fermentation lower pH. Herbs and spices add antimicrobial compounds that enhance the preservation effect. Plus, unlike other methods that punished your taste buds, alcohol marinades actually made meat more delicious. This was seasonal preservation tied to brewing cycles. When fresh ale came from the monastery brewery, meat got a boozy bath. When new wine arrived from southern vineyards, it was preservation time. Harvest festivals often featured meats marinated in whatever was fermenting that week. Different alcohols worked better with different meats, and medieval cooks figured this out through centuries of delicious experimentation. Strong ale for beef. The robust flavors complemented each other. Sweet wine for pork. The sugar balanced the fat. Mead for lamb. Honey flavors enhanced the meat's natural richness. English manor houses developed elaborate ale marinades, using herbs grown in monastery gardens. French chateaux created wine marinades that were basically liquid luxury. German regions combined beer with local herbs like juniper and caraway, creating flavors that defined regional cuisine. Alcohol marinades solved several medieval problems simultaneously. They preserved meat for short periods, improved flavor dramatically, and could be prepared quickly when unexpected guests arrived. Plus, the alcohol content made them safer than water-based preparations. But this wasn't long-term storage. Alcohol marinades bought you days, not months. They were perfect for feast preparations, harvest celebrations, or religious festivals when you needed meat to stay fresh just long enough for the party. The preparation was almost ritualistic. Meat arranged in wooden vessels, herbs layered between pieces, alcohol poured over everything until completely submerged. Some recipes called for daily turning, others for complete submersion and patience. Results varied dramatically by alcohol strength, herb selection, and time. Light ales produced mild flavors and short preservation. Strong wines created intense marinades that could preserve meat for weeks. Distilled spirits, when available, created marinades so potent they were basically edible antiseptic. Finally, the most expensive and exotic preservation method of all: honey sealing. This was medieval luxury preservation, the Rolls-Royce of keeping meat fresh. Only the wealthy could afford to entomb their protein in liquid gold. In medieval times, honey was literally worth its weight in silver. Bees were considered magical creatures. Honey was nature's perfect food, and wax was precious enough to seal royal documents. Using honey to preserve meat was like using champagne to water your garden. Technically effective, but financially insane. But the science was brilliant. Honey's incredibly low water activity, around 0.6, creates an environment where bacteria simply can't function. Its natural acidity, around pH 3.9, adds another layer of microbial hostility. Plus, honey contains hydrogen peroxide and other antimicrobial compounds that actively fight spoilage. We know honey works for preservation because archaeologists have found perfectly preserved honey in Egyptian tombs over 3,000 years old. Still edible, still sterile, still chemically identical to fresh honey. If honey can survive millennia, preserving meat for months was child's play. The process was elaborate and required considerable skill. First, the meat was partially cooked to eliminate surface bacteria. Then it was completely coated in honey, not just dipped, but thoroughly encased like a sweet amber shell. Finally, it was placed in ceramic vessels and sealed with layers of beeswax. Different honeys produced different results. Wildflower honey was mild and neutral. Heather honey was dark and intense. Acacia honey was light and delicate. Some wealthy families maintained relationships with specific beekeepers, commissioning custom honey blends for their preservation chambers. Storage was as important as preparation. Honey-preserved meat was kept in dedicated chambers, cool, dry rooms lined with ceramic vessels, each carefully labeled with contents and dates. Some wealthy medieval households had honey cellars rivaling modern wine collections. The transformation was remarkable. Honey didn't just preserve, it transformed. The meat developed complex sweet flavors that were completely unique. Some medieval recipes describe honey-preserved meats as sweet flesh or candied protein, suggesting flavors closer to dessert than dinner. This preservation method was as much about displaying wealth as preserving food. Serving honey-preserved meat announced to guests that you had money to burn, literally. It was edible, conspicuous consumption, medieval flexing through food preservation. But for those who could afford it, honey preservation produced results that were genuinely extraordinary, sweet, complex, completely unlike anything we eat today. It was preservation elevated to art form, proof that medieval cooks could create luxury even while solving practical problems. 30 days later, the moment of truth. 10 preservation methods, ranging from ancient techniques to medieval innovations. Some looked exactly as expected. Others had transformed in ways that would surprise their creators. First, the visual inspection. The dry salted meat looked like it had been mummified. Leather hard, crystalline with salt deposits, but perfectly preserved. The brined meat was paler but softer, with herbs still fragrant after weeks of soaking. The smoked meat looked like it came from an artisanal deli. Mahogany-colored, with a surface that gleamed like polished wood. The air-dried meat had transformed into something resembling expensive bresaola, dark and concentrated. Then came the real test. Taste. I assembled a panel of 5 volunteers, from food historians to professional chefs. Nobody knew which method was which. The results? Prepare for surprises. The confit was universally acclaimed. This tastes like it was made by angels. I would pay restaurant prices for this. How is preserved meat better than fresh meat? The fermented sausage shocked everyone. This is better than anything I've bought. Tangy, complex, perfect texture. I need this recipe. The honey preservation created confusion. Is this meat or dessert? Sweet, but not sickeningly sweet. Completely unique flavor profile. Even the harsh methods had their defenders. The salt-cured meat, after proper preparation. Intensely meaty flavor, like concentrated beef essence. The smoked meat. Perfectly balanced smoke and salt. But beyond taste, every single method worked perfectly. After 30 days, not one piece showed signs of spoilage. pH levels, moisture content, bacterial counts. Everything confirmed that medieval preservation wasn't guesswork. Beagle creme. It was applied science, centuries before anyone called it that. Time for the definitive ranking. Scored on preservation effectiveness, taste, historical accuracy, and practical medieval application. Number 1, confit in fat. Medieval French peasants created something that modern restaurants can't improve upon. Perfect preservation, incredible taste, practical for anyone with access to animal fat. Number 2, cold smoked and salted meat. The combination that built empires, fed armies, and powered exploration. Still used today because it simply works. Number 3, fermented sausage. Terrifying process. Incredible results. Medieval biotechnology that produces flavors, modern science struggles to replicate. The middle ranks revealed surprising insights. Air drying, simple but requiring perfect conditions, produced some of the longest-lasting results. Vinegar pickling created intensely flavored meat that solved religious dietary restrictions. Even the luxury methods earned their place. Honey preservation created flavors impossible to achieve any other way. Aspic demonstrated that preservation could be art as well as science. These weren't desperate survival techniques. They were sophisticated food technologies developed by cultures that understood ingredients, time, and transformation in ways we've largely forgotten. 10 medieval preservation methods. Tested with modern equipment, but traditional techniques. The results? Medieval cooks weren't just surviving, they were creating flavors and textures that modern food science struggles to replicate. In our world of refrigeration and preservatives, we've traded variety for convenience. Medieval preservation offered dozens of ways to transform meat, each creating unique flavors, textures, and nutritional profiles. But these techniques aren't just historical curiosities. In an age of power outages, supply chain disruptions, and growing interest in traditional foods, maybe medieval preservation deserves a comeback. These methods are sustainable, use minimal resources, create no waste, and produce foods with complex flavors that industrial processing can't match. Their preservation as cuisine, survival as art form. Which method surprised you most? Which one are you brave enough to try? Drop your thoughts in the comments.